Nice to have all of you back here. Did everybody get a handout? If not, they're at the back. Anybody not? Missed one? Why don't we just take a minute yet to read through the quote that you find there on the sheet, and maybe some of you want to read through the prayer as well. We'll just take a couple minutes to do that, guys. All right, for those who just came in, there is a handout in the back that might prove helpful, but I don't think...
You don't want to sit here.
A couple announcements that I need to make here at the beginning. One has to do with the use of the facilities here. I was asked by one of the deans here to ask people two things. One, that people not use rooms in this building either before or after the lectures for any particular reason. Evidently that must have happened sometime, and they asked that we not do that we use this room from 7:30 to 9:30, that's all. And also they asked that we not use the parking lot till after 7 o'clock. I don't know if I fully understand that, but it is, we use these buildings at the goodwill of the university, and we try real hard to maintain that. And it's our linkage with the campus, and we have no legal rights to these buildings, and it's through goodwill that we're able to use them. So we do try in every way, both at our masses on Sunday and lectures and so on, to try to cooperate. So they asked two things: that we not arrive here till after 7 o'clock, evidently, or park out here, and that we not use the rooms before or after. The parking garage down there is available. I'll tell people again that it seems fairly easy to park in that parking garage and walk through Bowman Oddie building and to get fairly close to this place, Catacorner across the street here. So that's, if you have trouble parking, that might be one way of doing it. Another announcement here is for those taking this course for religious education credit, we don't have a form tonight. I would hope to have one next time. But who's ever in charge of this said that if you fill it out tonight, write the same information down you usually do, but you're to say what you want it for, which is either for basic or advanced elective or advanced spirituality or advanced scripture. So If you would write down one of those 4 things, evidently it would facilitate the people who give the credit. Okay, enough by way of announcements, and then I remind you that this is part of a long series, 18 lectures on the spiritual quest with guidance from Karl Rahner. The emphasis in the course is on the spiritual quest, so that each class has got to do with some particular kind of question that seems to be important to us as human beings, important to us as we try to deepen our spiritual life. The with guidance from Rahner means that we're trying to look at the thought of the great German Jesuit theologian who died last March 30th, Karl Rahner, written a lot of books and so on. We're trying to look at his thought to guide the sequence of the course of these 18 lectures and to give us some insights on each of the questions that arise. Beth Sullivan was kind enough last quarter to work out a bibliography for us at the various libraries. If people want to look at this copy, I have one here between, so it tells us sort of the Toledo Public Library, what books they have by Rahner, Carlson Library, and so on, as well as our Newman Library, which is over in the ARC, or Interfaith Center. So there's a lot of people who want to do more reading. We got a lot of books here. Believe me, if you start reading Rahner's works, you will not run out. As I've told people before, just the list of what he wrote in translation, 2nd edition, comes to over 4,000 in the listing. So you've got a long ways to go if you're going to read all of his stuff. But people, I'll have this list here, and maybe we can duplicate some of these and have more copies for people on. It's the same one we used at the beginning of last quarter. So this series now is dealing with the question of Jesus Christ and our understanding of the church. And the first 3 will be dealing with our relationship with Jesus Christ, and then the next 3 with the church. Series of 6 each Tuesday evening. We hope we get a break on the weather as we go along. It's amazing to see so many people out tonight with the kind of weather we've had. But we welcome you all. It's good to have you here. Now, I want to begin tonight by talking about this question of the search for role models. And one of the things that strikes me is the importance of having role models. Somebody once said that if we did not have dialogue with the past or have heroes in our lives, we were greatly diminished human beings. And I think there's truth in that we need our hero figures. We need models of how we would want to live. We need flesh and blood examples of how one functions as an effective human being. We say in our culture that actions speak louder than words, and that's really true, isn't it? We can give all the sermons in the world and tell people what to do, but what they pick on most, it seems, is how we actually act, how we are, how we function, and so on. Aristotle said that if you wanted to know what virtue is, like the virtue of justice, you don't think about it theoretically, he said. What you do is you go find a just person and observe how they act. So the Greeks had that idea that we learn by imitating, that we see it in the concrete as human beings live out particular virtues. And I think as one looks at that question of role models, it's clear that we don't find many perfect ones walking around. So that's why I think Aristotle said, well, if you got a particular virtue you want to figure out how to live out, you look for a person who exemplifies that one. You don't look for a perfect person who does them all. One doesn't find that. Seems like part of wisdom in life is to be able to take people at their best, to pick up on the good qualities that they have and to learn from those. That has always seemed to me a more constructive way of living, rather than every time we encounter a person saying, well, I don't like that, or they got this vice, or they turn me off in this way. That's always seemed to me to be a sort of a waste of energy, where it seems much more positive to be able to pick out the qualities, the virtues, and to examine how people do that, learn from them. I suppose it's largely a process of osmosis in many ways. often think of this in terms of counseling and dealing with people who have grown up in poor family situations and appears have never seen in action how one might function as a male or as a female. That there's often seems to be a great difficulty in overcoming that lack. You can see the way most of us can look at our parents and see the kind of qualities we've picked up from them. You know, there's a lot of times dealing with young people and talking about their parents, they will begin to exhibit the very qualities that they don't like in their parents, which is often a very strange thing, and to call it to attention is often very shocking, like, my heavens, you know, I'm acting like my father does here, who's got this terrible temper or something. So it's clear that we need these role models. We pick up traits. Our personality, our being, is largely formed in interaction. Our identity is largely sociological, it seems to me. That is, we're constantly picking up the signals and sorting out and deciding what we like and what we don't like. So we need our heroes to guide us and to give us a sense of who we are. But I think we always also need the heroes for inspiration, people who can excite us. I think if we've been lucky in our lives, I suppose if we had one teacher who turned us on. Most students I know are people who've gotten excited about the academic life and like to read and study and think and so on, can usually point to a particular teacher along the way who encouraged them, who said, you can do it, or you got some brains, tap that, and sort of we liked them. They thrilled us, they turned us on. You know, I often tell that story, I guess the weather brings to mind, but Gabriel Moran, the theologian, was one of my own hero figures like that. I mean, who inspired me in a sense of teaching. He loved to teach. He did everything meticulously. He prepared tremendously. And, geez, I would have done anything to get there to his class. You know, I remember a great snowstorm in New York when I was taking a course from him, and I was prepared to walk through that snowstorm to get to class. I wouldn't miss it for anything because he could turn me on, because he could excite me intellectually. I remember there was a sister who used to sit next to me in class, and she'd always fall asleep. And that was one of the great mysteries to me in all of life. Was to try to figure out how that woman could fall asleep with this great teacher in front of her. It really mystified me. I never could figure that out. But anyway, so it seems as though we need these other people around who inspire us, excite us, and get us going and tell us, geez, it's neat to be alive, to do something you can accomplish. I think some people, I remember a lad telling me he was sick in the hospital. Well, he was very sick and so on, and one of the famous athletic figures wrote him a letter, a coach. If I'm remembering right, it was Jerry Faust or Digger Phelps at Notre Dame, and say, and just that reaching out seemed to give this lad an inspiration at that moment. So we need the hero figures. Now, it seems as though what is true in our culture today is that we lack this to such a degree. You know, I think we have to ask ourselves, who are the hero figures? Who are the people that excite people? Does this even happen? I saw on television the other night, they were showing on the news, I believe it was, about the gangs in the various big cities. Maybe some people saw, I think it was NBC News. And these people with apparently no real adult role models of civil behavior that they could look up to at all. Almost entirely in terms of their peer group, almost entirely turned in on that. And thus very little hope, very little catalyst for growth, very little challenge to the small world of that peer group, these people roaming the streets. They lack those role models. So often it seems like our young people feel that way. We're talking about the rash of suicides that we have had, and the great fear recently that in a particular school that a well-known young man, well thought of and so on, committed suicide, that he almost would become the hero figure. That sort of behavior would be something to be emulated. A lot of fear of that, and even some evidence that people would begin to make sort of a cult figure almost out of these people who commit suicide. Again, a member of the peer group, no chance for critique or for larger vision, turned in sort of thing. Very bad, I think, for our young people to have just those kinds of role models and not having the adult figures to look up to. And then, some of the people I guess we do tend to look up to in the culture, the admired people, one wonders about their depth and so on, the admiration of movie stars, or even of athletes, or our astronauts and so on. One wonders about the breadth and the depth and so on that is involved in all of that. I think it becomes very interesting to see that as we grow older, whether we maintain any hero figures. Where are the hero figures for us? Are there still people around who inspire us, who can turn us on, who can provide an example of exemplary living for us? That's an interesting question to ask oneself right at the beginning of all this. Who would my own hero figures be? For years, my hero was Al Kaline. For years, the first thing I did every morning was open up the paper and find out how Al did the previous night. That's true. Right? And how many years did he play? Over 20 years. That was a long run. Al was carrying on for me for all those years. And live and die with that. And I remember when he retired, there was something missing. It's not the same to look at the box scores the next morning for me. Probably never will be in a sense. Now, what does that mean if boyhood heroes die or pass away? What takes its place? So, search for hero figures. Well, if we move that into the level of the church, we might continue that analysis. That is, the saints have traditionally played that role for many people. The saints were the hero figures. And I don't know how true that is anymore. I think some people maybe are still in shock over the demise of St. Philomena. Or St. Christopher, who many of us have our confirmation names after and so on. What kind of shocks did that give to the, St. Philomena never existed, or St. Christopher is a legendary character. We found out a whole lot about the saints, that the stories that we have been passed on were maybe not true or embellished and all of that. I don't know what kind of shocks or how we've dealt with that as time goes on. A lot of sense these days that one of the reasons we don't have more vocations to the priesthood is because the young people don't find the priests around to be role models, to be hero figures. It's one of the common analyses of why we don't have as many people choosing that way of life. That somehow the priest's life does not seem enticing. They don't seem very often to be whole human beings, or don't seem committed to the work, or don't seem to project an image that would say, hey, this is a neat way to live somehow. I think myself, what function age has with this, I think in most professions, there was always a way in which the people moving up, or the younger people, would look up to the older people in the profession and say, well, they're my hero, or that's my role model. That's how I would like to be. And I think in my own life, how many older priests I would look up to that way. Who would be the ones that I would go to or say, here's a wise man, I'd like to engage him in conversation and so on. I must honestly admit it, for myself, that would be very, very limited. Now, I don't know what that says about the generation gap, about the quick changing, complex world where maybe the way I envision them having carried out their priesthood is much different from the way I try to do it now, and therefore one wonders whether the wisdom jives or not. No, but we can ask ourselves, do we, in our own professions, our own way of living, are there still people we look up to that would provide some sort of model and say, geez, I'd like to get there or be like that? I wonder how many sisters have older members of the community who would inspire them like that. So, another way perhaps of analyzing all of this. Well, that's a beginning point here, a way of raising the question. It seems to me we need our hero figures, we need our role models, and it seems to me in the culture in many ways we are lacking precisely that. Well, I'd like to take a minute or two here to remind you that the whole purpose of these series of lectures is to promote discussion and thought and reflection. That's why I have the handout and the questions on the handout and so on. I'm always hoping that people will go out from here and talk about it with a spouse or a friend, or stop and have a drink and talk it over and so on, or that there will be personal reflection, maybe journal writing and so on. That's what I'm after and hoping to do. I consider my lectures to be a catalyst to get the creative juices flowing. So I'd like now to take a minute or two break. I'd ask you to turn to the person next to you now. You might look at the questions that you find on the sheet, but no, I don't want you to do that. No. I'd like you to talk to the person next to you about your own heroes. Whether you find heroes in your own life yet, or whether there have been in the past, how they function for you. Just going to do this for a couple minutes. Now it's into that situation that I would like to present my thoughts on Christology here, understanding of Jesus Christ, and to try to put him forward as a role model for us, as a hero figure, as one who could inspire us, one whom we could attempt to imitate in life, one whom we could commit ourselves to. Jesus Christ as role model, as exemplar. I often like to talk about Christ as the best that we have produced in this whole evolutionary process, the best that the human race has ever come up with, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, when you begin to talk like that, the problems emerge. In other words, it's often been the case that people have not been able to make Jesus into that kind of exemplar or role model. Proof of that comes from the fact that very often Christian people have tried to place somebody else in the center of their piety, like one of the saints, or with us Catholics, like the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we've not been able to feel genuinely that we could find an example in Jesus of Nazareth. We couldn't not achieve identity with him. And one of the reasons that is the case is because people have not been able to appreciate the humanity of Jesus. Karl Rahner said that he felt that the majority of Christians were in sort of an implicit heresy on this question. That is, they were effectively denying the real humanity of Jesus. So very often in the past I noticed if I would get up and give a sermon on the divinity of Jesus, that would be fine and there would be no flack or problems. But if I would give a homily on the humanity of Jesus, that invariably caused some people a problem. And they would come back with, yes, but you didn't say that he was God. Or yes, all of that talk seems to deny that he really is God. And so, one of the questions Rahner always asked people to ask themselves, can you say that Jesus shuddered before the mystery? or that he went to his death in darkness, or that he feared the unknown character of the death that he was about to undergo. One could ask a whole series of questions like that to check out and to see if one really can appreciate the humanity of Jesus Christ. So, it is clear that if he's going to be a role model for us and we can identify with him, then he has to have been like us. He has to have gone through the struggle as we know it. And it seems important to be able to work out a theology that buttresses that sense, that founds or grounds it. So we might start out by trying to develop an appreciation of the emotional life of Jesus. The Gospels are filled with all the marvelous stories about Jesus and his emotional reactions to things. I suppose one of the clearest ones is the fact that he cried when Lazarus died. Now that becomes a problem for many people. I mean, they ask, well, if he knew he was going to raise Lazarus to life, why did he cry? Or some people will respond, well, he must have just cried to give his disciples an example that you should be sad when a friend dies. In other words, that's the kind of thinking that is very often come into people's minds. The pure fact that Jesus cried because he was sad very often is hard for people to deal with because they are not really in touch with the full humanity of Jesus. So what we have to affirm clearly with the Council of Chalcedon and with the whole Christian tradition that we're dealing here with a man like us in all things but sin. A man with a true human nature. So that Jesus would have cried when Lazarus died precisely because he was sad. And because he did not have knowledge of all future events that were to occur. We'll get to that in a minute. Something like the throwing of the people out of the temple and the anger there is very often a large problem for people. One of the reasons this is true is because in our culture today, we still live with a lot of repressed anger, a lot of rage. A lot of people are not able or willing to admit that they're upset, that they're angry. We aren't good. We can throw tantrums maybe or blow our top after we've held it in for a real long time. But it seems rather rare to find people who have constructive ways of dealing with their anger. And because, as a culture, we seem to be so negative on anger, it's hard to imagine Jesus getting angry. And yet that's what the Scriptures tell us, and that he not only got angry or felt anger, but he acted on it. That's even worse. He acted on it and threw these guys out of the temple. A marvelous piece of artwork in my room that Jesus cleansing the temple. It gives a real dynamic sense of Jesus in action. You get a feel for this anger that would have been coming out of him and flying into action and so on. So it appears important to us, if we're going to identify with Jesus, that we would be able to enter into this emotional life. He got angry like we do. He was sad like we at times are. And then I suppose that idea of fear, the agony in the garden story, that very earthy kind of thing where Jesus is really fearing his impending death, fearing what is going to happen here in a tremendous anxiety. And so, the figure of speech is he was sweating blood. Figure of speech we still use today. Sweating blood over this situation. So can we imagine Jesus fearful in this way? And I think as well, the psalmist, the words of the psalm in Jesus' mouth on the cross, Father, why have you forsaken me? The worst kind of desolate feeling that we would have. We can sense that the Master Jesus also went through. Father, why have you forsaken me? Darkness of it all, the feeling of loss, of absence. Isn't that interesting? Evidently the feeling of absence of the presence of God to him. So, it seems important to be able to be in touch with that emotional side of Jesus. Now, secondly, I would think it's important to be able to see Jesus as a person of faith, as the model of faith. That is, one who was called upon to surrender himself to the Father, one who had to believe, even believe in spite of very often. Now, one of the things I often think about with this is the failure of Jesus' mission. You know, he was not really, we like to think of him as a successful preacher with big crowds and so on. But the Galilean mission really did not go all that well. It appeared to be a failure. It might be one of the reasons he felt he had to go to Jerusalem. And so in the midst of that failing mission and his failure to convert Israel as he had been called to do and as he really desperately wanted to do, there came out then this faith dimension, this somehow deep sense that despite all of this, somehow God would bring the kingdom to fulfillment. So we're seeing Jesus here as one who stands in a position of faith vis-a-vis the one he called Abba, over against the Father. And so that's why we can honestly say that Jesus prayed. He didn't pray to himself, but he prayed to the one he called Abba, Father, a man of prayer, a man who needed prayer to sustain his active life. So, second point, trying to get at this sense of Jesus being a person of faith, one who had to trust Abba, hand himself over, surrender. And that faith, of course, is shown most completely when, in the midst of the worst darkness, the desolation, Father, why have you forsaken me? Then he comes up with the response to this desolation, not despair, but into your hands I commend my spirit. That dialectic, that interplay, you see, between the darkness, the despair, and yet the trust seems to be what characterizes this faith of Jesus. Thirdly, if we're going to be in touch with the humanity of Jesus, it seems important for us to be able to appreciate that he grew in his own self-understanding. So that we dare not, as Ronner says, think of Jesus as one who always knew everything, who had every future event clearly in his mind. There's a lot of indications in the Scriptures that Jesus didn't know things. So the woman came up behind him, touched his cloak, and the healing power went out of him, and his response is, who did that? Remember in Luke's Gospel it does say, and I'm a little leery of using this too literally, might be cheating here just a bit, I really shouldn't do that. But it does say in Luke's Gospel that Jesus grew in wisdom and age and grace before God and men. We've at least commonly used that as an indication that Jesus was not static, that he didn't wake up at the age of 6 and said, geez, I'm God. You know, but that we're dealing here with someone who grew in his own self-understanding. And I think that really becomes, again, an important part of seeing the humanity of Jesus. To be a human being means you gradually acquire knowledge. So he is like us in all things. That's what Jesus himself was about. I always imagine him sort of gradually coming to an appreciation of his own mission, of who he was. Again, very imaginatively, I see Jesus contemplating his Hebrew Scriptures, reading about the suffering servant as written about in Isaiah, liking that and saying, geez, I'd like to model my own life on the suffering servant. That's a neat way to live, to be for others, to suffer for others. And before long, Jesus is trying to identify with that suffering servant, and at some point in his life he says, my heavens, I am the suffering servant. That's exactly who I am. Thus growing in his identity. And I can see him meditating on the Messiah, on all this talk of the coming of Jesus. And the coming of the Messiah. And that he will come and save his people, the Son of David. Meditating on that and coming to the conclusion one day of saying, that's who I am. I am the Messiah. I think it's clear that in this growth and knowledge of Jesus, we have to affirm that he came to the point in his life on this earth where he was able to say that he was the final prophet. We get a remembrance of that in the Scriptures when it says, "Amen, amen, I say to you." Not like, well, I got this partial insight here and I'll share it with you, or let's dialogue about it. But it is, "Amen, amen, I say to you." This is how it is. Karl Rahner makes the point that there is no other prophet that he knows of in the history of the world who thought of himself or herself as being the final definitive prophet, who thought that no one would ever come after them who would enlarge, enhance the message that they had to give. Probably the only claimant in history to be the final definitive prophet, have the last word from the great God. So that we, in this growth in Jesus' self-understanding, we do see him as coming to this sense of who he was and what his mission was. His mission was to spread the kingdom, and he was the bringer of the kingdom, the absolute Savior, the final prophet. Exactly how we articulated that is a matter of great debate. Surely we cannot imagine Jesus walking around during his lifetime, if the Synoptic Gospels are at all right, and saying something like, "Hey, wait till I tell you, before Abraham was, I am." Or "the Father and I are one." That kind of language that we find in John's Gospel does not make much sense on the lips of the earthly Jesus. The Synoptics do not give us that kind of picture, and many scholars would feel that all of that talk is something that's read in from the past into, read in after the resurrection of Jesus into his earthly life. That preserves our understanding of Jesus, who is working out his own identity and is partial in his understanding and restrained in his expression of all of that. I suppose the thing that maybe most clearly brings us out is Jesus' apparent lack of understanding when the end of the world would come. So that many remembrances in the Gospel indicate to us that Jesus thought the end of the world was coming soon. This generation will not pass away till all these things happen. The early disciples thought the end of the world was coming soon. Evidently, that was part of the message of Jesus. It's imminent, it's coming, don't fool around. Now is the moment of decision. And so, evidently, we find, in fact, Jesus himself said this, is recorded in Mark's Gospel. When is the end of the world coming? His answer is, I don't know. Neither the Son of Man nor the angels in heaven know this, only the Father. So, that's a third area that I would say that where we would talk about this knowledge of Jesus. Trying to get at the humanity of Jesus. His emotional life, we can identify with that. When we're angry, despairing, down, when we're joyful and things are going well, in all of those kinds of cases, it is possible to identify with the Jesus who went through the same kinds of things. As we struggle with our own faith and doubts, as we try to deal with the despairs and the despondencies that can take us over, when we feel like we're hanging by the thread, it is possible to identify with the Jesus who said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" And when we feel so partial in our understanding and so limited in our ability to comprehend, and when that body of knowledge that we'd like to know seems so big, it is also possible to identify with the Jesus who had his own lacks in that regard and who grew in wisdom, age, and grace before God and men. So, that is, to me, the first step here in being able to find Jesus to be a real role model, is the ability to understand the humanity of Jesus. Now, perhaps you need some sort of way of dealing with the obvious problems that come up there. One of the obvious things is that we also say that Jesus is God. Now, what you have to see about that sentence is traditional. But the sentence, Jesus is God, does not function in the same way as a sentence that John is a man does. In the case John is a man, that's identity. He's identified as a man. But in a sentence, Jesus is God, it is not a statement of identity. It's a statement of union. Now, that's what when they called Skilovex to Rome, and they said, will you agree with the statement that Jesus is God? Well, he said, yes, but you have to distinguish it out. If you would go further with that statement, you could say the God is triune, is Trinity. Would you want to say the sentence, Jesus is the Trinity? Well, even the people in Rome didn't want to say that. Jesus is the Trinity. Do you see the problem that comes out there? Jesus is God is a statement of union. It's a statement that's something like this, that this man, in this man Jesus, the one who we call God, is personally present to us. That in this Jesus, the divinity and the humanity have come close together and are joined in a union. But as the Council of Chalcedon reminds us, the divine and human natures remain distinct. We have to affirm it's not like Jesus had two psychologies going, and in half of his right half of his brain, he knew he was going to raise Lazarus the next day, and his left half, he didn't know that. That would be a wrong way of thinking about who Jesus was. We have to affirm his full humanity. And we have to affirm that he was able to stand over against the Father. We also have to affirm that he was so, as Ronner liked to say, characteristic phrase. Here was a man so open, so responsive to God, so willing to receive, so obedient, that therefore it's true to say he was God personally present in our midst. That union could happen between God and the man Jesus. Well, the last 3.5 minutes is for all the theologians present who had the problems. For the rest of the people, it's a simple matter of saying, okay, how can I achieve a deeper identity with this Jesus who emoted and learned and who was a man of faith? At this point, I'm going to take another break. And I'm going to ask you to perhaps talk to the person next to you and to see indeed how you would respond to that statement that Jesus went to his death in darkness, or he shuddered before the mystery. And you might try to say to the other person what that does to you emotionally to say that, whether you rebel against it, affirm it, sounds right, doesn't, bothers you, or what. But anyway, I'd invite a little dialogue in that question. How do you respond to the idea that Jesus shuddered before the great mystery we call God? Let's take a couple minutes to do that. To begin the next section, I have two more sections in what I want to say here. I just remind people who came in late of our couple of announcements. If you're taking this for religious ed credit, please fill out, if you don't have a form, fill out the usual information and hand it in to me. And then we ask people to not use the other rooms in this law center before or after this class. Okay, the next point that I want to try to make here has to do with the question of loving Jesus. Now, Ronner likes to tell the story of a time he was talking to a Protestant theologian, and they were trying to compare their Christologies and how they really understood Jesus and so on. And Ronner said that he thought the test of a Christology was whether you felt as though you could throw your arms around Jesus in love. And the way Ronner tells the story, that his theologian friend said, Well, yeah, I guess you could say that if you don't mean it too pietistically. So, Ronner likes to say that in his early life, he didn't know what that meant. Or he was really not into that kind of piety. I think as a younger person, Ronner would never have said, well, yes, I could throw my arms around Jesus. So that's a way of introducing this question here now of the role model, Jesus, the exemplar, forming a relationship with Jesus. I suppose one of the questions is, can we actually say there's a way in which we love Jesus Christ? Now, I mean, there would be certain problems connected with that right away, it would seem. One would be, well, he lived a long time ago. I mean, how could you love somebody who lived so long ago? Well, if you tried to get around that problem, one of the things one would say is that, well, our claim is that although Jesus did live a long time ago, that he's been raised to life and he continues to live now. Therefore, it may well be possible to love him now. Another way Ronner likes to talk about that problem of the remoteness of Jesus is to do an analysis of human love as we experience it. And he points out to us that indeed it seems that love can often conquer time and space. We say we still love the deceased loved ones who have passed to the next life. We still say, well, I do love them, and I think we feel that, or there's a way in which we think that's true even though we don't see them on a day-to-day basis. Seems also true to say that love can transcend space, geography. So it seems possible to love somebody who's far away, even who's been far away for a long time, we haven't seen in a long time. So Ronner says the craziness of that idea of saying you're going to love Jesus maybe isn't so strange if you factor in those things. One, that he has been raised to life and still exists, and two, that love seems able to conquer this, or talk of the love of God has really been a subterfuge to keep from loving people, the ones who are around here. It's the same thing that we know psychologically, I think, that it often seems easy to love those people who are sort of far away, or at least that we don't see all the time, and seemingly so much harder to love the person who's right here all the time, whose abrasive edges rub us the wrong way. I mean, a common thing, isn't it? It seems harder to sustain the love, at least the active, caring, heartfelt love with those people that we are around a lot, close to. I suppose just simply because of the abrasiveness of the human situation. So, I believe that, so it's easy to say, well, I'm a loving person, I love everybody, it's just my spouse that I'm bitching to, that I've grown hard-hearted about. It's this person, I'm a loving person, me. But it's this group of people I live with that bugs me, It's that one I can't stand here. Close by. So, what I'm saying is that talk of the love of Jesus maybe to some people sounds as though it's a substitute for real human loving, for getting around to really caring about the people who are in our path, our family members, the people we work with, and so on. Well, what about the problem of the fact that I mean, can you really love somebody you never really saw or interacted with? Well, I mean, I suppose some of us fantasize. I mean, you can fantasize about loving somebody, some ideal figure that you maybe never personally interacted with, famous person or something. You could do that. But I mean, how do you overcome the fact that we didn't walk around with Jesus or shake his hand or hear him preach a sermon and so on? Well, I suppose one way around that problem is to say, well, we do know him. We know an awful lot about what he was like, what he taught, kind of person he was through the Scriptures. That's one of the things that the New Testament does for us, especially the Gospels. What it seems to do is mediate for us the experience that a particular group of people did have of Jesus. It's like the bridge between us and him. So some people say when they read the Scriptures, read the Gospels, that Jesus comes alive for them. That, they can imaginatively enter into that world. They can feel what it was like to have been in his presence and so on. So maybe the way you'd get around that, if you really wanted to get into this loving Jesus thing, is to find the picture of him, find the image, find the Christ of faith as portrayed in the Scriptures. Maybe one of the key ways to accomplishing this would be to become more familiar with the Gospels, to read them with commitment, with love. One theologian has once said that you'll never know what the Bible is about, what the Gospel has to say, if you read it as an objective observer. If you read over against or as an outsider, it simply won't work. I mean, it's a nice exercise. You can learn a lot of things, but you can't really enter into it. It seems like there's a whole other thing that happens to us when we enter into it, come into that world, and commit ourselves to the person who's represented there. Then it seems that new things can happen, illuminations can occur. You can begin to understand life in a deeper way. But when you do that, there's another problem. Full of problems with this thing. And it's the problem that Ronner himself said that he had in his early life. That is, when he read about Jesus, what captured him or what he was into was the idealism there, the interesting message, the kingdom notion that Jesus talked about. In other words, when he would read about Jesus, and what attracted him was those ideals, like, wow, yeah, he was for love, love your neighbor. That was neat, he was for forgiving people when they hurt you. That's neat. He had a neat philosophy of life where he said, don't get uptight. Don't get too uptight because look at the lilies of the field and so on. So that Ronner said when he was a young man, that's how he thought of all of that. Understand? I mean, it's possible that you read that, and there's a lot of young people today that would never be willing to say that Jesus is the Son of God or the final prophet, would be able to say, boy, he had a neat message, man. That guy was with it. He taught love, and I'm into love. That's terrific. So, do you see what I mean? One of the problems is say, well, you don't love ideals, you don't love a teaching, really, although we use those words, but we love persons. And so if one thought of what it says in the Scriptures in that sort of way, then you couldn't really love Jesus either. How many objections have I raised now to this thing? About 6. About loving Jesus. I mean, how the problems involved in that. And yet, I suppose despite all those difficulties, the interesting thing is that there seems to have always been people who have said that they do that. who love Jesus in a real, emotional, feeling, intellectual, insightful, committed way. I suppose one way, that's marvelous, isn't it? That's interesting. Someone was contrasting the long run of Jesus with somebody like Mao. You talk about hero worship, role models, and so on. Look, you had a whole culture given over to inculcating Mao and his teachings as the way of life. The little red book everyone carried around. You had a cultural revolution. You had a whole massive effort of every person in society being brainwashed with this idea. In less than a generation now, Mao is out. It's amazing, isn't it? Especially in contrast to Jesus, where you didn't have a massive brainwashing thing going on and so on, but you had something else that must involve this commitment to a person, this thing that we like to call love. So it seems as though it does happen. People say they feel the presence of Christ. They feel that they are emotionally moved by Him. They feel that they talk to Him, enter into conversation with Him, pray to Him, and receive inspiration in back. That they say they love Jesus Christ in a real way. Now, not just metaphorically. You see what I'm saying? They say they do it with all the kinds of characteristics that we associate with good, human, loving relationships. Now, I would say all the answers that I gave to the objections, would be needed to be overcome before one would be able to do that. No, not intellectually, but they would have to occur in one's life, in one's emotions, in one's commitments. Clearly, part of this is the idea of dedication, committing oneself to this Jesus of Nazareth. Now, what are you going to do if you're a person that's outside that circle? One of the things that seems important to me is to say that there are a variety of pieties. I find it sort of inspiring for Ronner to be able to say that he went through a good part of his priesthood without ever being able to say that he could put his arms around Jesus in a loving embrace. In other words, here was a man who had another piety going. And it would seem to me that would be a hopeful kind of message to people who have not grown yet into this fuller thing that we might want to call the love of Jesus. I wonder what kind of questions that raises for people. Let me just test that and so on. Does that whole thing I'm saying here bring forth particular questions? Yeah. What's missing in that, I hope people heard that, I think it's a common kind of statement today among certain pieties within the Christian world. The relationship seems to be one of praise and worship, right? And not a lot of the other characteristics we would usually associate. My own analysis of that is that what is lacking is that the sense of the humanity of Jesus Christ. Where you would get these other parts of the relationship going, where there would be identification emotionally, or a feeling of empathy, that Christ would know what it means to be in the midst of the darkness, that one could feel His presence even then, at least on the on the edges or as a source of light in the midst of the darkness. So my analysis of that would be that what is missing there is an appreciation of the humanity of Christ himself. In other words, that relationship sounds like the one you would have with God, that would see Jesus as God and sort of leave it go with that blanket statement. Yes?
I heard you speak often of, maybe not Jesus, but part of the Trinity is the one who seeks us, one who calls us Lord. And one of the phrases in my mind is talking about loving Jesus. You have a relationship with a person that's not a static relationship. So Jesus is a person in history who lives within a time frame, and who lives and died and rose and is in that niche. We can't love him unless there is a relationship there, unless there's a give and take, unless he also needs our love, unless we change to then grow within that relationship. Not just me growing in the relationship, but our relationship growing and maybe even the other person growing. It's difficult to have a human relationship with someone who doesn't respond and is.
Well, I would try to look at that a number of different ways, and I don't know that I have a sufficient answer to that, but I think playing it off against our human relationships and commitment, I would start with this part of our experience. That is, we have loving relationships with people, and they are partial. They're limited. People sometimes respond well, but a lot of times they disappoint us. A lot of times we can't totally give ourselves to the other person either. So that there is, and sometimes the person that we love, goes through periods of time when it is static. They don't seem to be getting much from what we're trying to do for them. And maybe someone would say, geez, I think my husband's love's about where it was 20 years ago, or I don't see much growth in our relationship. So, while the person would still sit there and say, yeah, but I still love him, that hasn't wavered. So I would say, looking at our human experience, there's limitation built into this interaction. Now, the other thing that I would say about this ability to love Jesus, in terms of the role model thing we were talking about, and this need for an exemplar and so on, what is true, I think, about Christ is that we have found in Jesus Christ the perfect respondent. We find there the one person who will not disappoint us. And what that means is that it ought to free us, and I think this is the way that Christian life works at its best, to totally commit ourselves, because we know he's totally trustworthy. What always holds us back, of course, in human relationships is maybe the other person doesn't treasure my gift of self. Maybe I don't confide this part of me because I don't know if she's going to understand or not. I don't know if she's going to be upset with that or put me down for that or what. In other words, what happens in human relationships, it seems, that it's always limited precisely because the limitations built into the people involved. With Christ, if he is all that we say he is, then he is the perfect lover and the one who would never disappoint us, the one to whom we could commit ourselves totally and completely, the one who would finally satisfy the yearnings of our hearts. And I believe that the best of our experience says that to the degree we do that, we find ourselves liberated and free. Now, from the other side, to attack your question directly from the way you posed it, although I think it had implications in it from what I just said, but one of the things that we say about Christ is the growth in Christ. We taught that St. Paul had the idea of the pleroma, which means fullness. He used to talk about Christ growing until he would be complete at the end time. Now, one of the ways that Christ grows is through our responsiveness. That is, our effort to build up the kingdom, or, in this metaphor, to build up the body of Christ. So it is possible, at least, that one could work that into one's analysis, and say, well, yeah, I am contributing in this love relationship. I'm not, it's not just that he doesn't need me. That's an interesting theology that we've developed in our own time, that in a way God does need us. That's a very partial, limited statement, but to move the evolutionary spiral forward, as Teilhard de Chardin said, requires our cooperation with God. To co-create this world means we've got to work at it. Whether somebody said there's that statue with no hands of Christ, and it leads into the notion that, we are the hands of Christ. In a sense, he needs us to spread the kingdom, to create the community of love. So maybe in that way you could get a little more sense of reciprocity, of mutuality, and the kind of thing we like to happen in personal relationships. I see that perfect lover thing fits in here. That's the notion that it is finally in union with Jesus Christ at the end time that we find our fulfillment. Only then do we know what love fully is all about and experience the fullness of love. That's what we end up saying as Christians, isn't it? That Christianity really is a commitment to a person and not the acceptance of a philosophy of life. It's the commitment to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The person comes first. The life comes first. The interaction comes first. Everything else in terms of dogma and theology and even scriptures come after that. That's the primary thing that went on. That's what distinguishes Christianity out from most other philosophies, ideologies, even religions.
Jim, I'm aware of the need immediate. I need to feel special for our relationship.
But it's not exclusive. I think the only thing that I could say in answer to that is that the way we experience our own needs in human relationships would somehow be deficient in the total picture. That, put it this way, in the kingdom, you wouldn't feel the need to be loved more than somebody else. It's the way Jesus responded to the desire to be first among the disciples. In the kingdom, it isn't like that. You got it wrong. You don't have to be first or above somebody else or exclusive or anything else. You're loved uniquely as yourself. I think that's what we keep claiming in the Christian message. God holds us in the palm of his hand, calls us by name. Jesus has unique love for us, and I think that's true because he knows us as we are. But that other desire for exclusivity or for higher order, if that analysis is right, that would be a way in which theology would sort of be teaching psychology. Or faith would be making some sort of a statement that our analysis of the human condition would have to pay attention to. In the kingdom, presumably, you would not have that desire for exclusivity. Now, I mean, one of the things that I'm leery of in all of this talk is that it lifts the Christian life out of the ordinary, the real, the everyday, and the hard, gritty business of loving other people. As Dorothy Day said, love is a harsh and dreadful thing. And it seems like that characteristic I wouldn't want to lose in this analysis of the love of Jesus. I mean, the fact that, of the quality of his love for us doesn't mean we don't grow. It doesn't mean that we don't feel deficient or that the darkness is taken away. That would be a mistake. I mean, I'm almost leery of playing this section up too much for losing part of that. I suppose that's one of the reasons I presented in terms of all of the problems. I mean, it seems to me you could get to a valid statement of that, or a valid existential living out of that relationship only after doing a lot of those other things. I'd be leery of getting there too soon. Put it that way. I'd be leery of that, just by way of my own sober realism about it. And I guess that's what I love so much about Ronner in this. His willingness to say, I mean, I think that's an achievement of his older years, is being able to say, he never wrote that in his earlier stuff at all, that he was going to throw his arms around Jesus. That's an older man talking, who I think has wrestled through so much other stuff before he could come to that kind of statement. Shall I say the last section of what I want to say? I think I will say it briefly and then see if there's questions and so on. We break at 9:30 at the latest, and sooner if we run out of things to say. The third thing I was trying to say Jesus as role model, as exemplar. First thing is to get in touch with his humanity. Secondly is to be able to commit ourselves in what we would call a loving relationship. Only then would Christ really be revealed as the exemplar. As an objective observer, we would never appreciate what it means to say he's the best that we ever produced. Because it's only commitment, dedication, handing ourselves over that would reveal that truth. But we all know that. We talk about love all day, but it's until you love a person that you know what it is. Okay, third thing then. I will talk about under the heading of the imitation of Christ. What does it mean to say that we're going to imitate him? After all, that's what we try to do with role models in a way, is imitate. Well, I think Vivian brought this up in her comment, raised the problem. That is, Jesus lives in another situation, another historical period. What would it mean to imitate him? Well, I mean, I don't think it means that you walk around with sandals or something, or that you refuse to learn how to write or something, or whatever. It would seem in an imitation, when you talk about the imitation of Christ, it doesn't seem like it means sort of a slavish doing exactly all the detailed things he did. Well then, I mean, that seems sort of obvious. Well then, what does it mean? And what are we all called to do? How would we imitate Christ? Well, the early Christians imitated Christ. They thought the way they would do it especially was through martyrdom. That was the way you really imitated Christ. That's why we always praise the martyrs. They imitated Christ, went to their death for the faith. But then what happened, it seems as though that martyrdom ran out. The Romans quit persecuting them. You got to Constantine, and we became the in group. No, we are now part of the establishment, man, and the persecutions drop out. So then, I mean, what happens in terms of imitation? Well, it seems as though the way people mostly thought they would imitate Jesus was through things like poverty and chastity and obedience. The vowed life. And yeah, I mean, you know, you think of those early saints, I mean, that's the kind of people they were. So, in other words, it seems as though when people were going to imitate Christ, what they didn't say, well, I'm going to imitate Christ by bopping into a wedding feast once a week. No. Or walking around in the fields and observing the lilies. It seems as though what people did was pick out certain aspects of his life and say, well, that's what we're going to imitate. Do that, live that simple life like he did. And of course, we still have that today, don't we? We have people who make vows to that effect. We also have people who just do that, thinking, taking a pattern themselves on Jesus, I'm going to live simply. But it would seem that not everybody would be called to that. So, I mean, if we're not into that, what do you do about imitating Christ? Well, one of the things that it's very common for people to say today, and remember that's running through the whole of the Christian history here. It's one of the things that's created problems for married people very often, isn't it? Raising families and doing ordinary things. I mean, how do I take Jesus as a role model? The presumption has always been, well, it is priests and nuns who could really only do that. Probably growing out of this whole thing here of the way you really imitate Jesus by doing this poverty and chastity especially. And ruled out a hell of a lot of people from imitating Christ very often. Well, today, we have a new way of thinking about this. One of the things we say, well, we will imitate Christ by having, as our bishops say in the economics pastoral, a preferential option for the poor. That is, in the modern world, the way you would imitate Christ is by having a special care for the downcast, for the marginalized, for the people on the fringes of society. Maybe you'd be involved in social justice concerns or having a special charity for the poor people. Our bishops are saying that's an important part of imitating Christ today. He did have that kind of piety himself, and maybe that's the way we do it. Ron raised a question. He puts a question mark. He says, but is it true that every Christian would have to, in their regular piety, exercise a preferential option for the poor? Well, what about people who are doing other things in life? I mean, living pretty ordinary lives and maybe building up the kingdom in other ways and trying to Christianize their business world, for example, and they hobnob with middle-class people all the time, and their big thing is to try there to create harmony and peace and humanize that situation, treat workers with dignity and so on. You know, would we rule them out from the imitation of Christ because they don't seem to have this preferential option for the poor? You see, what I'm after here is to figure out a way that we can all imitate Christ, so that married people can get in on the act, and middle-class people can get in on the act, and all of us can some way or another really feel, sense, that we are taking him as a role model and imitating him. Well, Ronner's got one answer to that. And he says there's one way we all got to do it. I guess it's the only way he can think of. And that is, the one way we all imitate Christ is by dying with him. sense it's the commonness of all of us. It is the thing that we all eventually have to do. Ron likes to say it's the freest thing we ever do. It is the most significant thing we ever do, is to die. It's a total person thing we do, and that what we have is there the great opportunity to die with Christ. So what Paul said is that if you die with him, you will also rise with him. But Ronner says that death isn't something you just do at the end time. It's not like I got to wait X number of years to get my chance to imitate Christ. But what Ronner says is we live our whole life in preparation for that there are all these minor deaths that go on. There's all of these opportunities to die to self. And so it would be, therefore, in the dying to self, that we're probably called upon to do some of that every day, that we would be imitating Christ in a very real way. And married people could do that, single people could do it, young and old can do it, all kinds of people can do it, every human being could do it. That is, try to die to self, which is to prepare for handing ourselves over in the last moment of what we ordinarily call as our death. What would that mean? Dying to self. I suppose all kind of simple ways. Simply when I set aside my own categories in conversation and try to think or act or respond in the other person's category. Or when I set aside some of my own needs and attempt to respond to the needs of others. Or when I would discipline myself in a certain way in order to free myself for spontaneous action for good in future situations. All kind of ways that one could think of dying to self, and each one of those we would be imitating Christ. That sounds real to me. We don't imitate him by wearing sandals. And not really nobody in our culture can imitate him in terms of total poverty. We really can't do that. Nor do we want to celebrate poverty to such a degree that it becomes like an opiate that says, whoopee, all the poor people are really the neat people. I heard a man talking like that recently. It turned off some people. They're talking about sort of praising the poor and what a neat life they have, and how they're happy, etc. And I think there's quite a negative reaction to that. It is the Marxist criticism of what Christianity would do. That is, say it's neat to be poor, so let's all stay that way, or leave those poor people like that. They'll get to heaven someday. So that, you see, there's great dangers in taking this imitation of Christ just in the level of poverty. First of all, even if you got a vow to do that, you can't do it in the world like real poor people can in Ethiopia, something like that. And there's a danger of celebrating it in some way. So what you look for is the deeper part of that. The poor are blessed, I would say, only if it causes them to be dependent upon God. Poor are blessed if they are able to somehow use that, despite that, to come to a greater surrender to the Lord himself. So, what Ronner is saying is there is a way that sounds real, that we can all do, won't get us into trouble, won't mess up our heads, won't fall under the Marxist criticism of opiates, and is a good, healthy thing to do. And that is, we imitate Christ by dying with him in our daily life, ordinary activity, all kinds of times. So we do that in order to be able to finally die with him, in order to be raised to life with him. Well, I've tried to attack this question of role model and identification from a lot of different angles. I'm hoping that that opens up some things. But I'll take a chance here and see if people want to make any comments, fill-ins, any kinds of responses. Yeah.
One point I'd like to do is we talked about aspects of Jesus as God, in coming together, the mind and the human. Is that a statement of weakness? Does that also reflect back on us as we embrace the human condition when we are aspects of divinity?
Yes, and I certainly like that. It's everyone hear that if you start talking about Christ and His divinity, what it does is remind us in some ways of who we really are. That is, people who are divinized. You see, I could have given this lecture from a whole other slant that would have been centered on the Spirit. In a way, it would be a much more comfortable kind of lecture to give, an easier kind of thing. Because, what it would say is fundamentally that the relationship is established primarily through the Jesus being life-giving Spirit. That His Spirit is in you, and His Spirit is in me, and that's what creates the bonding here. Spirit is in that person that we give the drink of water to who is thirsty. And that's the same Spirit that's in Jesus, and it's that Spirit that allows me to cry out, Abba, Father, and it's that Spirit that really allows me to love Jesus. So that, with that point, as soon as you begin to identify with Jesus, then it's not that He is unique in an exclusive way, like He's over here, totally different from us, we're here. The whole analysis I'm trying to do says, no, He's the best of what we're supposed to be as well. Rahner has a way of saying that Christology is really anthropology. That is, a study of Jesus is really a study of what we're called to be and what we're supposed to move toward. That's what the Greek fathers had a marvelous sense that we are temples of the Spirit. We are divinized. We got the same call as the man Jesus did. That is, to open ourselves to the Father's love. And the more we can open ourselves, the more we receive. That's why, that's exactly how we're like Jesus. We are all have a fundamental potency, potential to receive God's gift of His love. That's who we are. That's why we walk around, because He loves us. And the interesting thing is that the more we would open ourselves, the more He can give to us. That's how the growth in the spiritual life occurs. So we are divinized in the same way. So as soon as you can identify with Jesus from the other side, as I was trying to say it, emphasizing that side of it, the obverse is true as well. The more open we become, the more closer we are in that relationship. I think it's well said. We are divinized as well, yeah.
In recent years, in advance, the things are saying now that is Christ. Christ is in Christ. And often, a lot of life is like saying, while said, Christ into the whole, story. So certainly would be kind of an inspiration of leading the guiding in the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Our problem is to be responsive to that, isn't it? To be aware of it. No. It's easy to forget that, close it off, to block it out. What most people, I suppose, who are trying to live a good life find out they block it out in certain areas. It's operative in some ways, but not in others. Now, Paul has a marvelous sense of that, as he gave us that image of the body of Christ. And he gave us that notion, put on the mind of Christ. And Christ's life-giving Spirit. Christ dwells in us. I mean, it's a very realistic theology. Paul meant it that way. That you really do have the Lord within you. That's not just metaphor. I mean, that's pointing to a reality through a metaphorical statement, but it's pointing to a reality. But our problem is to be aware of it and responsive to it. And then that's where we find ourselves failing. So one way of saying that is, I'm going to try to imitate Christ or be responsive to his love, let his life influence mine, and so on. Yeah. See, other people have asked me about that, and that's a problem for many people. Everyone hear it, that part of the problem of the Gospels is that we don't see Jesus as laughing, playing, or having fun. It really is a problem. I think that one way of saying that is that to remember the Gospels are one-sided pictures. I have absolutely no doubt that he did all of those things because of the picture you get of the fullness of his humanity, of his maturity, of his integration, his togetherness. I have no doubt about that. I have no doubt that it would have been engaging to be in his presence and to enjoy his wit. Now, the one of the few cases I could think of is the banter with the woman about she wants him to cure his daughter, and he starts out by saying, he doesn't have time for this. He doesn't fool around with those people there, the foreigners, and he's not going to cast the crumbs here. So, I would, some people read that as harsh put down. I would tend to think of it more in terms of Jewish humor and banter. I mean, when I lived in the Bronx, I used to sort of live in that culture for a while, and I used to play golf with some people like that, and I mean, that kind of banter would have rung very true to me in listening to them talk like that. So, I mean, I can't prove that, but I tend to hear that as a humorous interchange, exchange, communication, rather than a put-down. So, I mean, maybe that's a place, but I mean, I think that really is, I could see it as a genuine difficulty. Now, all I can think of is a reminder that the Gospels are very partial, limited pictures of Jesus. We get only certain vignettes that they chose to keep for us. I think we have to supply the rest with our imagination.
Actually, another example of social life, I think that's the funny piece.
Yeah, okay.
I think that he's going because of the social time.
Yeah.
And I think that in the sense of humor, to me that what's good in the water is the wine.
Yeah.
Almost a sense of humor about that in terms of, oh my goodness, what did I do? Hey, look, sort of that discovering the kind of discovery of who he was, the first time to really,
Yeah.
I think when he smiles or whatever.
It might be able to intensify that feeling if you remember, if you translate the amount of wine, it comes out to 150 gallons. So that in itself could be a little humorous for this party, 150 gallons of wine. I think that these pictures come across. One of the interesting things about that is, in terms of his play or leisure or being involved, is the notion that they accused him of being a glutton and a drunkard. I mean, which suggests, there's got to be some basis in fact for that. They never accused John the Baptist of being a glutton or a drunkard, So in other words, we're dealing with someone who was evidently at the parties or partook of the banquet and so on. There has to be a basis in fact for that kind of charge of some sort, I would think. that would be another indication to us in the Scriptures that he really was, a man who lived in the secular world. No, Jesus was not a priest, and he wasn't a recluse, and he wasn't, a monastic type at all. Very much in the world, very much in nature and in society, and all of his examples and so on are derived not from the churchy world, not from the synagogue world, very little of that. It's derived from the world of ordinary life, his metaphors and symbols.
I was thinking this poem, I don't know if this would be a poem, but when our Lord picked us up and carried us during troubled times, and I think that's how we feel so close